Don't touch her." The words snapped through the cold evening air like a door slamming shut, sharp enough to make Aaliyah Carter pause mid-step, her worn sneakers planted on the cracked sidewalk as the city kept moving around her in a blur of headlights and hurried footsteps. But the sound that followed didn't move at all. It lingered, thin and trembling, the kind of cry that didn't belong in a place this loud, this crowded, this indifferent. And that was what made her turn, slowly, like her body knew before her. Mine did, because there, just a few feet away from the glow of a flickering street lamp, sat an elderly woman hunched against a cold metal bench, her coat too light for the 40-degree wind, her hands shaking as they clutched at a canvas bag that had tipped over, its contents scattered across the concrete like pieces of a life no one wanted to pick up. And people saw her. Of course they did. Their eyes passed over her in quick, practiced glances, the same way you glance at a cracked window or a broken sign, something unfortunate but not your responsibility, not your problem, not your time. A man in a tailored coat slowed just enough to frown before adjusting his scarf and walking on. A woman with a stroller pulled it closer to her side, her lips pressing thin as she avoided eye contact. Even a teenager filming on his phone angled the camera away as if the moment wasn't worth capturing. And still the crying continued, soft but relentless, like it refused to be ignored even when everything else insisted on it. Aaliyah felt it settle somewhere deep in her chest, heavy and familiar, the kind of weight she'd learned to carry without naming, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag as she hesitated, one step forward. Then another voice cut in, low and dismissive. Probably just another scam. A white-haired man muttered to no one in particular, his tone casual, almost bored. And that was when Aaliyah stopped completely, not because she agreed, but because something about the certainty in his voice felt louder than the crying, louder than the city itself, like a verdict already passed without trial. She exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cold. And for a second, she almost kept walking, almost let the moment dissolve into the same background noise as everything else. But then the woman's hand slipped, a small, unsteady motion, and a folded envelope slid free from her bag, landing face down near the edge of the curb, unnoticed by everyone except Aaliyah. And something in that small detail, that quiet fall, felt louder than anything else, like a signal, like a choice. And before she could think her way out of it, she turned back, her steps slower now, deliberate, the world around her continuing without pause. Cars passing, voices rising, heels clicking against pavement. But as she approached, the space around the woman felt different, colder somehow, quieter, like the noise had learned to avoid her. Aaliyah knelt down carefully, the concrete pressing through the thin fabric of her jeans, her hand hovering for just a second before gently reaching out, her fingers brushing against the woman's trembling ones. And for a moment, nothing happened. The crying didn't stop, the crowd didn't notice, the city didn't care. But then the woman's hand tightened, weak but real, and her sob caught in her throat like it had been waiting for something to hold on to. Aaliyah didn't say anything, not yet, because some things didn't need words, not right away. Instead, she shifted closer, her other hand moving to gather the scattered items, a worn photograph, a receipt, the envelope she'd seen fall, her movements careful, respectful, like each piece mattered even if no one else believed it did. Behind her, she could feel the weight of eyes, the quiet judgment, the curiosity, but she stayed, grounded in that small circle of cold light, her breath steady, her presence firm. And as the woman's crying softened into uneven breaths, she whispered something so faint it almost disappeared into the wind. "I thought I was gone." And Aaliyah's grip tightened just slightly, not in shock, not in surprise, but in recognition, because in a city this loud, this fast, this quick to look away, disappearing didn't always mean leaving. Sometimes it just meant no one chose to see you anymore. And right there, on that cracked sidewalk under a flickering street lamp, Aaliyah Carter made a different choice. The woman's fingers did not let go, not even when the wind picked up and pushed loose papers across the sidewalk, not even when a car horn blared somewhere too close. Not even when the man who had spoken earlier circled back with a slow shake of his head like he had been proven right about something no one had asked him to judge. And Aaliyah felt it then, that quiet tension pressing in from all sides, not loud, not aggressive, just present, like a room waiting for her to make a mistake. But she stayed where she was, her knees cold against the concrete, her breath steady as she picked up the last of the fallen items and placed them gently back into the woman's bag, her movements slow enough to show care, but certain enough to show she was not leaving. The street lamp above them flickered again, casting a thin gold light over the woman's face, revealing the deep lines around her eyes, the kind that came from years of seeing and being seen. And then slowly, from not being seen at all, Aaliyah reached into her own bag and pulled out a small paper cup with a plastic lid. The last of the coffee she had bought nearly an hour ago, still faintly warm. She hesitated for just a moment before placing it carefully into the woman's hands, guiding her fingers around it so the heat could settle into her skin. The woman looked down at it like she did not understand what it was at first. Then her lips trembled again, but this time no sound came out, just a long breath that seemed to carry something heavier than the cold. "Thank you," she whispered, the words uneven, like they had not been used in a while. Aaliyah nodded once, not making it bigger than it needed to be, because this was not about her, not really. It was about staying, about choosing not to disappear from someone else's moment. Behind them a security guard approached, his steps measured, his expression firm but not unkind. "You cannot sit here," he said, his voice low but practiced, like he had said it many times before. Aaliyah looked up at him, then back at the woman, then back again, and for a second the world seemed to narrow down to that choice: stand up and walk away, or stay and become part of the problem everyone else had already decided to ignore. She exhaled slowly, her voice calm when she answered, "She just needs a minute." The guard shifted his weight, glancing around at the small cluster of people who had started to linger, phones half raised, curiosity building now that something different was happening. "A minute turns into an hour," he replied, not harsh, just certain. Aaliyah nodded slightly, like she understood the rule but not the outcome. Then she adjusted her position, sitting a little straighter, her shoulder brushing lightly against the woman's as if to say without words that she was not alone. The woman leaned into that contact almost without realizing it, her breathing evening out, her grip on the cup steadying. And somewhere in that quiet shift, something changed, not in the crowd, not in the city, but in the space between them. Because for the first time since Aaliyah had turned around, the woman was no longer crying. She was just breathing, slow, careful, present, and Aaliyah stayed with her, not rushing, not questioning, just sitting there in the cold light, holding a moment the rest of the world had already decided to leave behind. The guard did not move right away, but his presence lingered like a line drawn quietly in the air, and Aaliyah could feel it, that invisible boundary between what was allowed and what was not, between helping and interfering. But the woman beside her leaned just slightly closer, her shoulder pressing into Aaliyah's arm as if she had already chosen which side of that line she needed, and that was enough. Aaliyah adjusted her grip on the cup, guiding it back when the woman's hand trembled again. The heat almost gone now, but still something, still real. "What is your name?" Aaliyah asked softly, her voice low enough to stay inside their small space. The woman blinked slowly, like the question had to travel a long way to reach her. "Margaret," she said after a moment, her voice fragile but clearer than before. "Margaret Whitmore." The last name landed differently, not louder, just steadier. Like it carried weight, even if no one around them recognized it anymore. Aaliyah nodded once, repeating it quietly. Margaret, not as a label, but as a way of holding her there, in that moment, in that place, where she was no longer just another figure people stepped around. A gust of wind pushed through the street again, sharper this time, and Aaliyah reached into her bag, pulling out a thin hoodie she had folded at the bottom. She hesitated for half a second, knowing it was the only extra layer she had for the walk home, then draped it gently over Margaret's shoulders, adjusting it so it would stay. Margaret's fingers moved slowly to touch the fabric, her expression shifting in a way that was hard to name. Not surprise, not disbelief, something quieter, something closer to remembering what it felt like to be cared for without needing to ask. Across the sidewalk the man from earlier had stopped again, this time not speaking, just watching, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, his certainty no longer as firm as before. A few others had gathered at a distance, their voices low, their phones no longer raised as high, because the moment had changed. It was no longer something to capture. It was something to understand, or maybe something they were not sure how to respond to. The guard cleared his throat lightly, shifting his stance. "Ma'am, we have services that can take her somewhere safe," he said, his tone softer now, less like a rule and more like an option. Aaliyah looked up at him, then back at Margaret, whose eyes had drifted down to the envelope now resting in her lap, her fingers tracing its edge like it meant more than the rest. "Margaret," Aaliyah said gently, "do you have somewhere you want to go?" The question hung there for a moment, suspended between them, and Margaret's hand paused, her breathing steady but slow. "I had a place," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "A long time ago." Aaliyah did not press, did not fill the silence that followed, because sometimes answers needed space more than questions did. Instead, she reached down and picked up the envelope, turning it carefully in her hands. The paper worn but not fragile, addressed in neat, printed letters that had not faded. And for a brief second her eyes caught a name, a title, something that did not match the woman sitting beside her on the cold sidewalk, something that suggested a different life, a different place, before the wind, before the bench, before the silence. Aaliyah glanced at Margaret, then back at the envelope, her brow tightening slightly, not in confusion but in recognition that there was more here than what anyone had seen. And as she held it there, just for a moment longer, the distant sound of approaching sirens grew a little clearer, cutting through the night like something that was about to arrive whether anyone was ready for it or not. The sirens did not rush. They grew, steady and distant at first, then closer, weaving through the hum of traffic until they became part of the moment, not interrupting it but pressing against it. And Aaliyah felt the shift before anyone said a word, the kind of shift that made people straighten, step back, reconsider where they stood and what they had ignored. She lowered her gaze to the envelope again, her fingers tracing the edge before carefully turning it over, the paper catching the streetlight just enough to reveal the print, clean, formal, deliberate, Margaret Whitmore Foundation. The words sat there quietly, but they did not belong to the woman beside her in worn shoes and borrowed warmth. They belonged to boardrooms, to plaques on walls, to places where names were remembered. Aaliyah blinked once, reading it again, slower this time, as if the letters might rearrange into something simpler, something that matched what everyone else had assumed, but they did not. And when she looked back at Margaret, the woman's eyes were already on her, not surprised, not defensive, just tired, like she had seen that realization before, many times, and had stopped expecting it to change anything. "You built something," Aaliyah said softly, not a question, not an accusation, just an observation placed gently between them. Margaret's lips parted slightly, then closed again, her hand tightening around the cup, as if holding on to that small warmth was easier than holding on to the past. "A long time ago," she repeated, her voice steadier now but carrying a quiet weight, the kind that did not ask for sympathy, only acknowledgement. Behind them the guard shifted again, his posture no longer firm but uncertain, his eyes flicking from the envelope to Margaret and back. The line he had drawn earlier no longer as clear. A woman from the small crowd stepped a little closer, her expression softening. "Whitmore," she murmured under her breath, as if testing the name against a memory she could not fully reach. And then it started, not loud, not sudden, just a ripple. People looking again, really looking this time, not past her but at her, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they thought they knew. The man in the tailored coat moved closer as well, slower now, his hands no longer tucked away but hanging at his sides, uncertain, and Aaliyah felt it all without turning, the attention, the shift, the late recognition that always seemed to come when it was already too late to matter. She did not hand the envelope back right away. Instead, she held it lightly, like it was not proof but a question. "They should know," someone whispered behind her, but Aaliyah did not respond, because knowing was not the same as caring, and caring was the part that had been missing. The sirens were close now, their red and blue reflections beginning to flicker across the windows and the pavement, washing over the scene in pulses of color that made everything feel sharper, more defined. Margaret's grip loosened slightly, her shoulders lowering as if the sound meant something final, something decided, and Aaliyah leaned in just enough for her voice to stay between them. "I am right here," she said, simple, steady, The kind of promise that did not depend on what came next. Margaret nodded faintly, her eyes closing for a brief second before opening again, not searching, not lost, just present. And as the lights grew brighter and the crowd shifted once more, Aaliyah finally placed the envelope back into Margaret's hands, not as evidence, not as a revelation, but as something that still belonged to her, something no one else had the right to claim. And for a moment, in the space between the approaching sirens and the quiet grip of their hands, the city seemed to hesitate, as if it was deciding whether this was just another passing scene or something it could not look away from anymore. The ambulance did not rush past them. It slowed, then stopped, its lights washing the sidewalk in quiet flashes that turned every face into a moment of decision. And for the first time since Aaliyah had knelt down, the space around them did not feel invisible anymore. It felt seen, but not in the way that mattered. Not yet. Two paramedics stepped out, their movements calm, practiced, not urgent but attentive, and as they approached, the small crowd shifted back just enough to make room. Just enough to pretend they had always been there for this part. Aaliyah stayed where she was, her hand still wrapped around Margaret's, steady, grounding, the warmth between them now coming from something deeper than the coffee. One of the paramedics knelt slightly, his voice gentle as he spoke. "Ma'am, we are here to help you. Can you tell me your name?" Margaret's eyes moved slowly from the lights to his face, then back to Aaliyah, like she needed to confirm something before answering. "Margaret," she said, clearer now, stronger than before. Margaret Whitmore. The name landed differently this time, not lost in the noise but carried by it. And the paramedic paused, just for a second, the kind of pause that said recognition was beginning, not complete, but forming. Behind him the man in the tailored coat stepped closer, his voice no longer dismissive. "Whitmore. The Foundation," he said quietly, almost to himself. And that was when the shift became undeniable, not loud, not dramatic, just real. People looking at each other, connecting pieces too late, their expressions changing not because Margaret had changed, but because they finally understood who she had been. And Aaliyah felt that too. The weight of it, the unfairness of it, the way value suddenly appeared when it could be proven. She tightened her grip slightly, not to hold Margaret back, but to remind her that she had been seen before any of this. Before the name meant something again, the paramedic nodded gently, his tone respectful now. "Ms. Whitmore, we would like to take you somewhere warm, somewhere safe." Margaret's fingers tightened around Aaliyah's hand at the word safe, her eyes searching hers again, not with fear, but with a quiet question, and Aaliyah leaned closer, her voice soft but certain. "I will stay until you are okay," she said. Simple, direct, the kind of promise that did not need to be repeated. Margaret exhaled slowly, a breath that seemed to carry more than just the cold, and nodded, just once, as if that was enough. The paramedics moved carefully, not rushing her, not pulling her away, giving her time to stand, to adjust, to remain present in a moment that had almost erased her. Aaliyah rose with her, keeping one hand close, not letting the connection break too quickly, the hoodie slipping slightly from Margaret's shoulders before Aaliyah adjusted it again, a small motion that went unnoticed by most but meant everything in that quiet space. The crowd had gone still now, not silent, but watching, differently, some lowering their eyes, others lingering as if unsure what to do with the realization settling in. The man who had spoken first stepped forward again, his voice hesitant this time. "Is there anything she needs?" he asked, the words awkward, unfamiliar, and Aaliyah looked at him for a brief moment, not unkind, but clear, then back at Margaret, because the answer had never been about things. It had been about presence, about choosing not to walk away. And as the ambulance doors opened, lights spilling out into the night, Margaret paused, her hand still in Aaliyah's, her voice barely above a whisper, but steady enough to carry. "You saw me," she said, not as a question, not as a surprise, but as a truth she had finally been allowed to say. And Aaliyah did not answer right away. She just squeezed her hand once, firm, quiet, enough to say everything that words could not. And in that small, held moment, before the doors closed and the lights shifted again, something had already changed, not in the city, not in the crowd, but in the space where one person had chosen to stay when everyone else had already decided to leave. The ambulance doors did not close right away. They stayed open, waiting, as if giving Margaret one last moment to decide whether she was stepping in to help or leaving something behind. And Aaliyah stood just outside the threshold, her hand still lightly holding Margaret's, not pulling, not guiding, just present, the kind of presence that did not demand anything in return. The paramedic glanced between them, then nodded slightly, understanding without needing to ask, and stepped back just enough to let the moment belong to them. Margaret looked down at their hands, her fingers still curled around Aaliyah's as if letting go would mean losing something she had just found again. Her voice came softer this time, steadier. "What is your name?" Aaliyah did not hesitate. "Aaliyah," she said. Simple, clear, and something about the way she said it made it feel like more than a name. Like it was something she carried with her, something she had learned to stand inside of. Margaret repeated it quietly, almost like she was committing it to memory. "Aaliyah," and for a second her eyes closed, not in exhaustion but in recognition, like she was placing that name somewhere safe inside herself. The crowd behind them had grown quieter now, not because they had nothing to say, but because they were finally listening, really listening. And the man in the tailored coat stepped forward once more, his posture different now, less certain, more careful. I can call someone," he said, his voice unsure. "The foundation, they would want to know." Aaliyah looked at him briefly, her expression calm but distant, not dismissing him, just not centering him either, because this moment did not belong to explanations or corrections. It belonged to Margaret, and Margaret alone. Margaret shook her head slightly, a small movement, but firm enough to carry meaning. "Later," she said, her voice quiet but resolved, and the man nodded, stepping back again, accepting a boundary he had not recognized before. Aaliyah adjusted the hoodie once more around Margaret's shoulders, her fingers careful, precise, making sure it stayed in place even as the night air shifted, and then slowly, without rushing it, Margaret loosened her grip, her hand sliding from Aaliyah's but not completely leaving, their fingertips still touching for just a second longer, long enough to say what words had already said and more. The paramedic stepped forward again, offering a steady arm, and Margaret accepted it, her movement slow but certain as she stepped up into the ambulance, one foot, then the other, the metal step catching the light as she moved. Aaliyah stayed where she was, just outside, watching, not because she needed to, but because leaving too soon would break something that had just been rebuilt. Margaret turned back once she was inside, her hand resting lightly against the doorframe, her eyes finding Aaliyah's again. "You stayed," she said, not as a question, not even as a statement, but as something closer to a realization. Aaliyah nodded once, her voice low, steady. "You needed someone to." Margaret held that for a moment, then gave the smallest smile, not wide, not bright, but real, the kind that came from being seen after a long time of not being seen at all. And as the paramedics prepared to close the doors, the lights still pulsing softly against the pavement, Aaliyah stepped back just enough to give them space, her hands falling to her sides, empty now but not lacking, because something had already been placed there, something that did not leave when the ambulance doors finally closed with a quiet, final sound. And as the vehicle pulled away slowly into the night, the red and blue lights fading into the distance, the crowd began to disperse, their voices low, their steps quieter than before, and Aaliyah remained for a moment longer under the flickering street lamp, the cold returning to her hands, the night settling back into its usual rhythm. But something was different now, not in the city, not in the sidewalk, but in the way she stood there, still, grounded, as if she had just witnessed something the rest of the world had almost missed entirely. The street did not return to normal right away. Even after the ambulance disappeared around the corner, there was a hesitation in the air, like the city itself needed a second to remember how to move again, and Aaliyah stood there under the flickering light, her hands now empty but still carrying the warmth that had been there just moments ago. She exhaled slowly, watching her breath fade into the cold night, the space around her beginning to refill with footsteps and passing voices, but softer now, more aware, as if something invisible had shifted and no one wanted to be the first to break it. The man in the tailored coat lingered a few feet away, his posture no longer rigid, his eyes no longer distant. He looked at Aaliyah, then at the empty bench, then back at her again, like he was trying to place himself inside a moment he had almost missed entirely. "You did something important," he said finally, his voice low, careful. But Aaliyah did not respond right away. She adjusted the strap of her bag, her gaze drifting briefly to the ground where the scattered items had once been, now gone. "Gathered, returned. I just stayed," she said after a moment, her tone even, not dismissing his words, but not accepting them as something bigger than they needed to be. The man nodded slowly, as if that answer carried more weight than the one he had expected. "Most people do not," he admitted, and there was no defense in his voice this time. Only a quiet realization settling in. Aaliyah glanced at him once, then looked away, not unkind, just uninterested in making the moment about him. Because the truth was not complicated. It had never been complicated. It had only been inconvenient. A woman from the earlier crowd approached cautiously, her expression softer now, her hands loosely clasped together as if unsure where to place them. "Is she going to be okay?" she asked, not out of curiosity, but something closer to concern. Aaliyah nodded once. "She is not alone anymore," she said, and the words landed gently but firmly, like a line drawn in a different place than before. The woman exhaled quietly, her shoulders lowering as if that answer gave her something she had not known she was waiting for. "I should have stopped," she added, almost to herself, and Aaliyah did not argue, did not reassure her, because the moment did not need comfort, it needed truth, and truth did not always soften easily. The woman gave a small nod and stepped back, her eyes lingering for a second longer before she turned and walked away, her pace slower than before, more deliberate, as if she was carrying something with her now, something she had not arrived with. The security guard returned to his position near the building entrance, but even his stance seemed different, less rigid, his gaze sweeping the sidewalk not just for rule-breaking, but for something else, something quieter. Aaliyah finally turned away from the bench, her steps slow at first, then steadier as she began to walk down the sidewalk, the city lights stretching ahead of her in long lines of white and yellow, her hoodie gone, her hands cold again, but her posture unchanged, grounded, certain, and as she moved forward, she passed by the same places, the same faces, the same rhythm of a city that had not stopped, but something inside that rhythm had shifted, not loudly, not enough to change everything, but enough to be noticed by those who were paying attention. A bus passed by, its windows reflecting her image back at her for just a second, and she caught a glimpse of herself in that glass, not different, not transformed, just present, fully present, and that was enough. Behind her the bench remained empty under the flickering light, but it did not feel the same as before. It felt like a place where something had happened, something small, something easily overlooked, but not meaningless. And as Aaliyah continued walking into the night, the echo of Margaret's words stayed with her, quiet but steady, not fading, not disappearing, just there, like a reminder that sometimes the difference between being lost and being found was not distance, not time, but a single moment when someone chose to see you and did not look away. The night did not feel as cold as it had before, even though the temperature had not changed, even though the wind still moved through the narrow streets with the same quiet bite. Aaliyah walked with a steady rhythm, her footsteps soft against the pavement, blending into the city's endless motion. But her mind did not move the same way. It lingered, circling back to the bench, to the trembling hands, to the moment when everything could have passed. Unnoticed, she reached into her pocket out of habit, then paused, her fingers brushing against nothing where her last few dollars had been, spent without hesitation, without calculation, and she did not regret it. Not even for a second, because what she had given had not felt like loss. It had felt like alignment, like something inside her had chosen before she ever had to think about it. A bus slowed beside her, its brakes releasing a long, tired sigh, the doors opening with a soft mechanical sound. She stepped inside, the warmth wrapping around her instantly, carrying the faint scent of fabric and rubber and something familiar. She moved down the aisle, choosing a seat near the window, her reflection faintly visible in the glass as the city lights passed in streaks of white and gold. Across from her a man in a work uniform glanced up briefly, then looked away, his attention returning to his phone. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place, just another passenger, just another night. But Aaliyah sat differently now, her shoulders relaxed but grounded, her gaze steady as it followed the movement outside. The bus pulled away from the curb, merging back into the flow of traffic, and for a moment everything felt the same, ordinary, predictable, until it did not. Her phone vibrated softly in her bag, a sound that almost went unnoticed. She reached for it slowly, pulling it out and glancing at the screen. An unknown number. She hesitated for half a second, then answered, bringing it to her ear. Hello, her voice calm, measured. There was a brief pause on the other end. Then a woman's voice, clear, professional, but carrying something beneath it, something urgent and careful at the same time. Is this Aaliyah, Carter? Aaliyah straightened slightly, her fingers tightening just enough around the phone. Yes, this is Aaliyah, she replied, her tone unchanged. The voice on the other end exhaled softly, almost like relief. My name is Rebecca Collins. I am calling from St. Mary's Medical Center. Aaliyah's gaze shifted to the window, the passing lights reflecting in her eyes as she listened. You were with Ms. Margaret Whitmore earlier this evening, Rebecca continued, not asking, confirming. Aaliyah nodded instinctively, even though the woman could not see her. Yes, I was, she said quietly. The bus moved over a slight bump in the road, the vibration traveling up through the seat, grounding her in the moment. She asked for you, Rebecca said next, and that was the first time something inside Aaliyah shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but enough to slow her breath just slightly, enough to make the noise of the bus fade for a second. She is stable, Rebecca added, her voice steady, but she has not stopped asking if you are coming. Aaliyah did not answer right away, her eyes fixed on her reflection in the glass, seeing not just herself, but the echo of everything that had just happened, the bench, the light, the hand she had held, the words that had stayed. I can come, she said finally, her voice soft but certain, no hesitation left in it. No question, just a decision. The kind she had already made once before without realizing it. Rebecca paused briefly, then responded, we will be here. Simple, direct. The call ended quietly, leaving Aaliyah holding the phone in her hand, the screen dimming as the bus continued forward, the city stretching ahead, and for a moment she remained still, not because she was unsure, but because she understood something now that had not been clear before, that sometimes staying did not end when the moment passed. Sometimes it followed you, asking again, waiting for you to answer the same way. She pressed the stop button, the soft chime echoing through the bus, and as it slowed to a halt, she stood, steady, grounded, stepping back out into the cold night, not returning to where she had been, but moving toward where she was needed next. The hospital did not feel like the city outside. The noise did not follow her through the sliding glass doors. It softened, replaced by a quiet hum of machines and distant footsteps that echoed down long, polished hallways. Aaliyah stepped inside, the warmth settling around her again, but different this time. Cleaner, still, almost too still. She paused just for a second, adjusting to the brightness of the overhead lights, then moved forward, her sneakers barely making a sound against the floor. The front desk sat ahead beneath a soft glow, a nurse looking up as Aaliyah approached, her expression shifting from routine to recognition in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. Aaliyah, the nurse said, her voice gentle, confirming without asking. Aaliyah nodded once, her hands relaxed at her sides but her posture steady. She is asking for you, the nurse added, stepping out from behind the desk, motioning for Aaliyah to follow, and Aaliyah did not hesitate, her steps matching the nurse's pace as they moved down the hallway, passing closed doors, muted conversations, moments happening behind walls that no one else could see. The nurse slowed near the end of the corridor, stopping outside a room where the light was dimmer, softer. She is resting, but she will wake when she hears you, she said quietly, her hand resting lightly on the door before stepping back, giving Aaliyah the space to choose, and Aaliyah reached for the handle, her fingers closing around it with a calm that came not from certainty, but from something deeper, something that had already decided. She pushed the door open slowly, the room unfolding in quiet layers, a bed, a chair, a monitor softly beeping in a steady rhythm, and Margaret, lying beneath a thin blanket, her face relaxed in a way it had not been on the sidewalk, her breathing even, her hands resting loosely at her sides. Aaliyah stepped inside, letting the door close gently behind her, the sound barely audible. And for a moment she simply stood there, taking in the stillness, the absence of cold, the absence of noise, the absence of everything that had surrounded Margaret just hours before. "Margaret," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough to reach across the room. Margaret's eyes did not open right away, but there was a shift, a small movement in her fingers, then another, until slowly her eyes blinked open, adjusting to the light, searching, and when they found Aaliyah, something changed, not dramatically, not suddenly, but clearly, recognition settling in like it had been waiting. "You came," Margaret whispered, her voice faint but steady. Aaliyah stepped closer, moving to the side of the bed, her hand resting lightly on the edge. "I said I would," she replied, simple, direct, and Margaret's lips curved into a small smile, the same one from before, quiet but real. "People say things," Margaret murmured, her gaze not leaving Aaliyah's. "They do not always stay." Aaliyah held that for a moment, then reached out, her hand finding Margaret's again, warmer now, steadier, no longer trembling. "I do," she said, not as a promise made in the moment, but as something that had already been proven. The monitor continued its steady rhythm, the soft beeping marking time in a way that felt slower, more intentional, and for a while neither of them spoke. They did not need to. The silence between them was not empty. It was full, carrying everything that had been said without words on the sidewalk, everything that had been understood without explanation. Margaret's fingers tightened slightly around Aaliyah's, her gaze drifting for just a second before returning. "They will come," she said quietly, not specifying who, not needing to. Aaliyah nodded once, her expression calm. "Maybe," she replied, her voice even. "But I am already here." And Margaret closed her eyes again, not in exhaustion, but in something closer to peace, her hand still holding Aaliyah's as if letting go was no longer something she needed to do. And in that quiet hospital room, far from the noise of the city, far from the place where no one had stopped, something continued. Not because it was expected, not because it was required, but because someone had chosen, once again, not to walk away. The room did not change when the door opened, but the air inside it did, a quiet shift that moved through the space before anyone spoke. Aaliyah felt it first in the way Margaret's fingers tightened slightly around hers, not in fear, not in tension, but in awareness, as if something expected had finally arrived. Footsteps entered softly, measured, followed by the low murmur of voices that tried to stay respectful, but could not fully hide their urgency. Aaliyah turned her head just enough to see them, two men in tailored suits and a woman holding a tablet close to her chest. Their presence controlled, professional, but edged with something unsettled, something that did not belong in a hospital room. They paused just inside the doorway, taking in the scene, Margaret in the bed, Aaliyah beside her, their hands still joined, and for a moment no one moved, as if they were unsure how to step into something they had not been part of. "Ms. Whitmore," one of the men said finally, his voice careful, respectful in a way that sounded practiced. Margaret's eyes opened slowly, her gaze drifting past Aaliyah toward the door, not surprised, not even curious, just acknowledging. "You took your time," she said quietly, her voice soft but steady. The man hesitated for half a second, just enough to show that her words had landed exactly where they were meant to. "We came as soon as we were informed," he replied, but the words felt late even as he said them. Margaret did not respond right away, her attention shifting back to Aaliyah, her fingers still holding hers. Grounding, present, the woman with the tablet stepped forward slightly, her eyes scanning the room before settling on Aaliyah, her expression polite but questioning. "And you are," she began, but Margaret's voice interrupted, not loud, not sharp, just clear. "She is the one who stayed." The words settled into the room with a weight that no title or position could match. The woman paused, her tablet lowering just slightly, as if that sentence had rearranged her understanding of everything she was seeing. The men exchanged a brief glance, their composure holding but thinner now, less certain. Aaliyah did not move, did not release her hand. She simply met their gaze for a brief moment, not confrontational, not defensive, just present. and that was enough to shift the balance in a way none of them had expected. "We have arrangements prepared," one of the men continued, his tone steadying as he returned to what he understood. "A private suite. Full care. Everything will be handled." Margaret listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, her breathing even, and when he finished, she gave the smallest nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "You always handle things," she said, softly, her eyes drifting back to Aaliyah again. "But you do not always see them." The room went quiet, not because the words were loud, but because they were precise, and precision had a way of cutting through things people preferred to leave vague. The man's posture shifted slightly, his shoulders lowering just enough to show that something had reached him, though he did not know what to do with it yet. The woman with the tablet cleared her throat gently. "We would like to speak with you." "About next steps," she said, her tone careful again. Margaret's fingers tightened once more around Aaliyah's, then slowly loosened, not fully letting go, just easing. "Next steps can wait," she replied, her voice calm. "Final, she stays." There was no emphasis, no raised tone, just a quiet decision that left no room for negotiation, and for the first time since they had entered, none of them spoke. They simply stood there, absorbing something they had not expected to encounter, not resistance, not conflict, but clarity, and Aaliyah felt it settle into the room, not as tension, but as something steadier, something that did not need to prove itself, because it had already been proven in a place where no one else had been willing to stand. And as the silence held, the monitor continued its steady rhythm, marking time in a way that no one could interrupt, not with titles, not with plans, not with anything except presence, the one thing that had already changed everything before they ever arrived. The silence did not break. It settled, deeper this time, like something had finally been placed where it belonged. And the three figures near the door did not step forward again, not because they could not, but because they understood, even if only partially, that this moment was not theirs to lead. The man who had spoken earlier lowered his gaze briefly, his polished shoes shifting slightly against the floor, as if the certainty he carried into the room had nowhere to stand now. The woman with the tablet closed it without looking down, her posture softening in a way that no instruction had taught her, and Margaret watched them, not with anger, not with disappointment, but with a kind of calm that came from no longer needing anything from them in that moment. Her attention returned to Aaliyah, her hand still resting lightly in hers. The connection no longer fragile, no longer something that needed to be protected, just present, steady. "They mean well," Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying no judgment, only recognition. Aaliyah nodded slightly, her eyes steady. "Sometimes that comes late," she replied. Not harsh, not dismissive, just honest, and Margaret's lips curved into that small, knowing smile again, the kind that understood both the truth and the space around it. The man near the door cleared his throat softly, stepping forward just enough to be heard but not enough to interrupt. "We would like to make this right," he said, his voice stripped of its earlier confidence, replaced with something closer to sincerity. Margaret did not respond immediately, her fingers tracing a slow, absent motion against the back of Aaliyah's hand, as if feeling something she had almost forgotten. "Right is not something you arrange," she said after a moment, her tone gentle but precise. "It is something you do when no one is watching." The words settled quietly, but they did not fade. They stayed, filling the room in a way that no explanation could. The woman with the tablet inhaled slowly, her eyes lowering as if she was seeing something beyond the situation, something inside herself she had not questioned before. Aaliyah felt Margaret's hand shift slightly, not pulling away, just repositioning, and she adjusted her own without thinking, maintaining the connection as naturally as breathing. The monitor continued its steady rhythm, a quiet reminder that time was still moving. Even if everything else felt suspended, "You should rest," Aaliyah said softly, her voice low enough to remain between them. Margaret nodded faintly, her eyelids lowering for a brief moment before lifting again. "Stay until I fall asleep," she said, not as a request, not as a command, but as something simple, something human, and Aaliyah did not hesitate. "I will," she answered, her tone unchanged, grounded, the kind of certainty that did not need reinforcement. The three figures Near the door stepped back slightly, not leaving, but no longer pressing forward, their presence quieter now, more observant than directive. And for the first time since they had entered, they were not leading the moment. They were witnessing it. Margaret's breathing slowed, her grip softening but not disappearing, her gaze drifting as the weight of the day began to settle into something lighter, something closer to rest. And Aaliyah remained exactly where she was, her posture relaxed but attentive, her hands steady, her presence unchanged, not because she had to be, but because she chose to be. And as Margaret's eyes finally closed, her expression peaceful in a way that had not been visible before, the room seemed to exhale, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to mark the shift. The man near the door lowered his head slightly, not in obligation, but in something quieter, something earned. And the woman beside him stood still, her tablet held loosely at her side, no longer a tool, just an object. And Aaliyah did not look at them. She did not need to, because the moment had already spoken for itself, not through words, not through status, but through something far simpler, something that had started on a cold sidewalk and carried all the way into this quiet room, something that could not be arranged, could not be scheduled, could only be chosen. And in that stillness, as the monitor continued its soft, steady rhythm, it was clear that the choice had already been made long before anyone else arrived. The room grew quieter as the minutes passed, not because the sounds disappeared, but because they softened into something steady, something that no longer demanded attention. The monitor continued its gentle rhythm, marking time in a way that felt almost protective, and Margaret's breathing matched it now, slow and even, her hands still resting in Aaliyah's without tension, without urgency, just there, present, as if it had always belonged. Aaliyah sat beside the bed, her posture relaxed but grounded, her eyes moving briefly toward the window where the city lights flickered faintly in the distance, a reminder that everything outside was still moving, still rushing, still choosing what to see and what to pass by. But inside this room, the pace was different, measured, intentional. The three figures near the door had not left, but they had changed, their presence no longer pressing forward, no longer filling the space with plans or urgency. Instead, they stood quietly, watching, learning in a way they had not expected to. The woman with the tablet shifted her weight slightly, then stepped closer, not enough to interrupt, but enough to be part of what was happening. Her voice, when it came, was softer than before. "We have reviewed the situation," she said carefully, as if each word needed to earn its place. "There are resources available, long-term care, private housing, full support." She paused briefly, glancing at Margaret, then at Aaliyah. "Anything that is needed." Margaret did not open her eyes, but her fingers moved slightly, a small response, a quiet acknowledgement that she had heard. Aaliyah looked at the woman, her expression calm, not resistant, but not impressed either, because the words were familiar, the structure of them predictable, and what mattered had already been proven somewhere else, somewhere without resources, without plans, without observers. Margaret's voice came after a moment, low but clear. "You are offering comfort now," she said, her tone neither critical nor grateful, just precise. "But comfort is not what I lost." The room held that sentence, letting it settle into places no one could avoid. The man beside the door lowered his gaze again, his hands folding in front of him as if trying to find a position that matched the moment. Aaliyah's fingers adjusted slightly around Margaret's hand, a quiet reassurance, not interrupting, not guiding, just staying. The woman with the tablet nodded slowly, her eyes no longer scanning, but focused. "Then tell us what you need," she said. And this time the question did not feel procedural, it felt real. Margaret opened her eyes slowly, her gaze moving from the ceiling back to Aaliyah, holding there for a second before shifting to the others. "I needed someone to stop," she said simply. And she did. There was no emphasis, no elevation in her voice, but the clarity of it left no room for interpretation. The woman inhaled softly, her shoulders lowering as if something inside her had finally aligned with what she was hearing. Aaliyah did not look at them. She did not need to, because the truth had already been placed in the room, not through argument, not through proof, but through action. Margaret's grip loosened slightly, her eyes drifting again. The weight of the day settling into something lighter, something closer to rest, Aaliyah, remained beside her, her presence unchanged, not because she was asked to stay, but because she had chosen to long before anyone else understood why it mattered. The city lights outside continued to flicker, distant and constant, but inside the room, something else held steady, something that did not depend on movement or noise or recognition, something quieter, something that had already changed the course of everything without needing to be named. And as Margaret's breathing deepened, her hand still resting in Aaliyah's, it became clear that what had begun on a cold sidewalk had not ended here. It had simply taken a different shape, one that no plan could replicate, no system could replace, only something chosen, again and again, until it became the thing that remained when everything else had already passed by. The room did not announce the ending. It eased into it, quietly, like a breath that did not need to be forced. The monitor continued its soft, steady rhythm, the same gentle sound that had filled the space since Aaliyah first walked in, but now it felt different, not just a measure of time, but a reminder that something had been held together when it could have easily fallen apart. Margaret's hand remained in Aaliyah's, lighter now, her fingers no longer searching, no longer holding on out of fear, but resting, as if they had found a place that did not need to be questioned. Aaliyah sat beside her, her posture unchanged, her presence steady in a way that did not draw attention but could not be ignored. The three figures near the door had moved closer without realizing it, not stepping into control, not reclaiming authority, but simply standing within the moment, no longer outside of it. The woman with the tablet held it at her side, untouched, unnecessary, her focus no longer on plans or procedures, but on something she had not been trained to measure. The man who had spoken earlier exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering as if something he had carried for a long time no longer had a place to stay. Margaret's eyes opened once more, not wide, not searching, just enough to see. And when they found Aaliyah again, there was no question left in them, only recognition, only peace. "You did not change everything," she said softly, her voice calm, almost reflective. Aaliyah did not move, did not interrupt. Margaret's fingers shifted slightly in hers, a small motion that carried more meaning than any explanation. "But you changed this moment," she continued, her gaze steady. "And this moment was where I was lost." The words settled gently, not heavy, not dramatic, just true. Aaliyah's hand tightened just slightly, her thumb brushing once against Margaret's, a quiet acknowledgement, not of accomplishment, but of connection, because nothing here had been done for recognition. Nothing had been done to be remembered. It had simply been done because it was needed. Margaret's breathing slowed further, her eyelids lowering again, not with struggle, not with resistance, but with ease, as if the weight she had carried into that cold night had finally found somewhere to rest. The room held still around her, the lights soft, the air calm, and no one spoke, not because they did not have words, but because they understood that words would only interrupt what was already complete. Aaliyah remained beside her, her hand still there, her presence unchanged, not waiting for anything, not expecting anything, just staying, the same way she had on the sidewalk, the same way she had in every moment that followed. And as Margaret's breathing settled into a quiet, even rhythm, her hand finally loosening but not leaving, something shifted, not in a way that could be seen, not in a way that could be measured, but in a way that stayed, the kind of change that did not announce itself, but remained long after everything else had moved on. The city outside continued as it always did, lights passing, people moving, moments beginning and ending without notice. But inside that room, something had been different, something had been chosen, and that choice had carried through every second that followed. Not because it was easy, not because it was expected, but because someone had decided, once, to stop, to see, to stay. And that had been enough, more than enough, because in the end, it was never about changing the world, it was about changing one moment, one person, one quiet space where someone had almost disappeared, and bringing it back to life simply by being there.